You only work alone to go see the simple signs. Just watch the Rolex, but I know you go get from some guy on KCx3. You also sell fake IDs, can't trick me. I see me all before you see.
You got an alley that you rented, but I know you got the hook up in your cousin who's the regional manager on weekday. She gave it to you for one night for free. Don't you wish it's over in real life?
You flaunt it like a Trump kind of money when you're really just a 26-year-old chump living with your mommy.
You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that don't know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Cheap, 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 cheap creeper. Cheap, 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 cheap creeper.
You're sitting in the corner trying to act smooth behind your dark sunglasses, watching every move I'm making. You almost feel your hands on me, so sick, babe, the way you die.
Creep, creep.
You're acting like you're just something boy when all you are is just a faker living with your mommy.
Mommy. You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that don't know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Cheap, 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 cheap creeper. Cheap, 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 cheap creeper.
Couldn't even buy me a drink if you wanted to. Don't be acting like you think I'm into you.
Let me spell it out so we're no longer confused.
Not just in hell,
No, no, no.
Cheap, cheap creeper.
Cheap creeper.
You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that don't know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that don't know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Cheap, cheap, a cheap creeper. Cheap, 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 creep, creep.
Cheap, 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 a cheap creeper. Cheap, cheap, you're just a cheap creeper. Street, who also sells fake IDs, can't trick me. I see me all before you see.
You drive an Audi that you rented from Alamo. You got the hook up through your cousin who's the regional manager on weekdays. She gave it to you for one night for free. Don't you wish you drove it in real life?
You flaunt it like a Trump kind of money when you're really just a 26-year-old chump living with your mommy.
You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that only know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper.
Cheap, 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 cheap creeper. Cheap, 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 cheap creeper.
I see you sitting in the corner trying to act smooth behind your dark sunglasses, watching every move I'm making. Can almost feel your hands on me, so sick, babe, the way you jive.
Creep, creep.
You're acting like you're Justin Timberlake when all you are is just a faker living with your mommy.
Mommy.
You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that only know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper.
Cheap, 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 cheap creeper. Cheap, 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 cheap creeper. You couldn't even buy me a drink if you wanted to. Don't keep acting like you think I'm into you.
Let me spell it out so you're no longer confused. Not a chance in hell, no, no, no.
You're just
cheap,
Cheap creeper,
Oh.
Cheap creeper.
You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that only know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. You can say whatever you got to say, but all I see is that you're just a cheap creeper. Sneaky eyes that only know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper.
Cheap creeper, cheap
Creep, creep.
Cheap creeper, cheap. You're just a cheap creeper.
Sneaky eyes that only know how to lie, but the truth I see is that you're just a cheap creeper.
Cheap creeper, cheap.
Creep, creep.
Cheap creeper, cheap. You're just a cheap creeper.